As the hearse approached the cemetery, the crowd began throwing stones. They shouted something over and over again. It was October 25, 1987, and the armored car was transporting the body of 6-year-old Leidedas Neves Ferreira to her final resting place, the Goiania Park Cemetery. Demonstrators tore down crosses from graves and threw them at the dead, but police shielded the ceremony. The mob still chanted across the graveyard as Leide was lowered into the earth. She was surrounded by a 700-kilogram block of lead and concrete, not to protect her from the attacks of the people, but to protect the people from her. Leide was the first victim of a radiation catastrophe in the Brazilian metropolis, which went down in history as the Goiania accident. And she was not to be the last victim. Only a year after Chernobyl, a tragedy happened here. Entire districts were contaminated, a nation was divided, and it cost a number of people their health or their lives. It all started quite inconspicuously on September 13, 1987, with 2 garbage collectors and their wheelbarrow. In medicine, radioactive isotopes are mostly used in radiotherapy, where a concentrated dose of radiation is directed towards a malignant tumor or group of cancerous cells to kill them. Sometimes tiny doses of radioactive materials called radiotracers are injected into the bloodstream of a patient, and the gamma rays they give off are imaged with the help of a special camera to create images of the inside of the patient's body. Hospitals and clinics where such procedures are available have strict protocols regarding the handling of those devices. When such a hospital closes and has to be demolished, the wrecking company has to be informed so that the instruments can be safely dismantled and the hazardous materials moved to a secured location. Failing to do so can lead to tragedy. Such an incident happened in the Brazilian city of Goiânia in 1987. 2 years prior, in 1985, the Institute Goiano de Radioterapia, a private radiotherapy institute, relocated to a new premise, leaving behind many old hospital machines and supplies. Among them was a teletherapy unit containing 93 grams of highly radioactive cesium chloride. At that time, the Radiotherapy Institute and the new owners of the premise were locked in a curt battle regarding the ownership of the abandoned site. The owners of the institute wrote numerous letters addressed to the National Nuclear Energy Commission, warning them about the danger of keeping a teletherapy unit at an abandoned site. The court, however, forbade the removal of any objects by either parties and even appointed a guard on the site, but it was not enough to keep out scrap hunters. On September 13, 1987, taking advantage of the absence of the guard, Roberto dos Santos Alves and 19-year-old Wagner Moto Pereira broke into the ruins of the partially demolished facility at Street 57 and used a wheelbarrow to steal a Cesium F3000 radiotherapy machine, weighing over 130 kilograms, which looked a bit like a dentist's chair with a large telescope attached. They took their fun to Roberto's house, thinking the stainless steel object could be valuable, but neither of them were aware that the shiny capsule they were wheeling home was highly radioactive. In Alves' backyard, the 2 scavengers began dismantling the device. That same evening, both Alves and Pereira began to vomit, which they assumed was due to something they had eaten. The following day, Pereira began to experience diarrhea and dizziness. He developed gamma-ray burns on his fingers, the size and shape of the canister's aperture, and his left hand began to swell. Pereira went to a local clinic, but the doctors, unaware of the signs of radioactive poisoning, dismissed his condition as an allergic reaction and just told him to go home and take rest. Meanwhile, Alves continued to tinker with the thing. 6 days after the theft, he was able to free the capsule from its rotating head. He broke the iridium window while poking the protective casing with a screwdriver. A dark blue light could be seen from within, the fluorescence of electromagnetic radiation. Thinking it might be gunpowder, he scoped some of the cesium out and attempted to light it, but the powder wouldn't burn. On September 18th, they both gave up further opening the cylinder and sold it, wrapped in an old carpet, to nearby scrap dealer Divera Vez Ferreira. He offered them 1,600 cruzados, about $25 at the time, for the scrap metal. That night, Ferreira went into the garage where the pieces had been placed and noticed a blue glow emanating from the source capsule. This glow was caused by the radiation ionizing the air molecules. Ferreira was sure whatever was in there had to be perhaps even of supernatural value. Excitedly, he broke open the double-shielded cylinder and released several right-sized grains that crumbled into fluorescent powder when touched. Fascinated by the blue light, Ferreira decided to make a ring for his wife out of parts of the glowing stone. Little did he know that he had uncovered a block of 93 grams of highly radioactive cesium chloride, consisting of 19 grams of cesium isotope 137. Total activity 50.9 terabecquerels, the same radioactive isotope that had leaked into the environment from the 1986 Chernobyl power plant explosion a year earlier and wreaked havoc. 19 grams doesn't sound like much, but that was enough to have an effect that went far beyond the junkyard. Ferreira took the capsule into the house. Over the following 3 days, Ferreira proudly invited neighbors, friends, and relatives to show them the miracle stone. Everyone was amazed by the powder, which glitters in the light and glows in the dark. Some rubbed them on their skin like glitter during carnival times. Ferreira's brother Adison, a bus driver, carried the glowing powder on public buses. His other brother Ivo took some of the powder home and decorated his dining table with cesium-137, spreading some of the powder on his floor. His 6-year-old daughter Laidedas Neves Ferreira later ate while sitting on the floor, absorbing some of the radioactive material. She was also fascinated by the blue glow of the powder, applied it to her body and showed it off to her mother. A junkyard worker took the cesium to his hometown of Annapolis. Parts of the irradiated metal capsule were sold and some of the cesium chloride ended up in the sewage system. Cesium-137, a beta and also gamma emitter due to secondary decay, is only produced during nuclear fission, with a half-life of 30 years. Similar to table salt crystals, sodium chloride, cesium attracts moisture and is soluble in water. It easily adheres to skin or clothing, which aided in its spread far beyond the city. On September 21st, Ferreira's 37-year-old wife, Gabriela, fell ill with vomiting and diarrhea. She went to a hospital for a diagnosis, but like Ferreira, she was told she had an allergic reaction to something she had eaten and was sent home to rest. Meanwhile, on September 25th, Ferreira sold the scrap metal to a second scrapyard. In Goiânia, just a few days later, many of those who had been in contact with Ferreira began to experience the first symptoms of illness: nausea, vomiting, itching, hair loss, or diarrhea. When ingested, radioactive cesium replaces calcium in the bones, inducing cancer in the bone marrow, which later causes leukemia. By this time, Ferreira's wife, Gabriela Maria Ferreira, became skeptical about the many illnesses around her. She carried the capsule in a plastic bag to the hospital on the bus. When she placed the sack on the desk of the doctors, saying that this thing was killing her family, about 90% of its radioactivity had already escaped. When one of the doctors saw the skin lesions, he knew it was due to radiation and placed the container outside the hospital on a chair in the garden. In the morning of September 29th, visiting medical physicist Walter Mendes Ferreira used a scintillation counter borrowed from Nuclebras, a national government agency which is involved in the nuclear fuel cycle, including searching for uranium ore, to confirm his suspicion. Goiania's population had been exposed to cesium-137 for 16 days. Even when he was some distance from the bag containing the fragments, the meter went to full-scale deflection. This unlikely reading led the physicist to assume that the meter was defective, so he returned to the nuclear agency to collect a different scintillometer. Whilst the physicist was away, the health authority doctor became concerned and called the fire brigade. The physicist only just returned in time to stop the firemen from throwing the source into the river. He argued for the immediate evacuation of the health authority building. The accident response started that evening. In the meantime, however, numerous people had already suffered high doses of radiation. 4 people died as a result of this radiation. 37-year-old Gabriela Maria Ferreira. She was exposed to a radiation dose of 5.7 gray. The physical unit gray describes the energy that hits an irradiated object. An exposure of 5 gray usually leads to death in half of the patients. 10 gray is considered a fatal dose. 2 of Ferreira's employees, Israel Bautista dos Santos, aged 22, and Admilson Alves de Souza, aged 18, and his 6-year-old niece, Laide das Neves Ferreira, who had eaten small quantities of the powder and had received an estimated dose of 6 gray. Several people survived high doses of radiation, including Roberto dos Santos Alves, who lost his entire right forearm, and Wagner Mota Pereira, who lost a finger on his left hand, with the others atrophied and disfigured. As well as Dever Ferreira, despite receiving a nearly fatal dose of 7 gray. He later died in 1994 of cirrhosis aggravated by depression and binge drinking. Authorities in Goiânia mobilized police, fire and civil defense forces, and a temporary screening camp was set up inside an Olympic stadium. It turned out that the radioactivity had been carried over 14 residential areas. Entire streets and squares were contaminated. 5 hospitals, 3 buses, 14 cars, 50,000 rolls of toilet paper, a number of banknotes, and 5 pigs. Cesium-137 contamination was found as far away as 100 kilometers or 62 miles from Goiânia. The abandoned place has a name only in the digital universe. On Google Maps, Street 57 is marked with the addition Cesium-137. When the decontamination began in November 1987, 112,800 people were examined. 249 were found to have significant levels of radioactive material in or on their body. 28 showed signs of radiation sickness and required treatment. A total of 85 houses were contaminated, 41 evacuated, and 7 buildings were completely demolished. All contaminated houses were cleaned with special vacuum cleaners. 1 color was used to clean houses and treat radiation patients: Prussian blue, also known as Berlin blue. A chemical property of the paint binds cesium, which led to the most extensive use of Prussian blue in the history of nuclear accidents. Roofs, walls, and ceilings were scrapped and repainted. True roofs had to be completely replaced. Soil was removed and the ground hastily covered with concrete to seal off the remaining radiation. A study performed in 2001 still found increased activity levels 10 to 40 centimeters below the surface, questioning the effectiveness of initial decontamination efforts. 3,500 cubic meters of radioactive waste had to be removed, which is now housed in a specially built park, Parque Estadual Telma Ortegal. The International Atomic Energy Agency, based in Vienna, stated in its final report that the radiation source contained 50.9 terabecquerels when it was removed, and that around 44 terabecquerels were recovered through the cleaning work. This left 7 terabecquerels in the environment. In other words, parts of the city are still radioactive today. The International Rating Scale for Nuclear Events, INES for short, has 7 levels, from incident to catastrophic accident. The Goiânia accident is classified as level 5, serious accident. This puts it on par with the Harrisburg reactor disaster better known as the 3 Mile Island, in 1979. A repetition of such an accident cannot be ruled out, but modern radiation therapy devices usually no longer contain any radioactive material, but generate the radiation similar to an X-ray tube by accelerating and decelerating electrons. When the devices are switched off, they no longer pose a risk of radiation. Today, indeterminable amounts of cesium-137 continue to seep into groundwater supplies from the contaminated soil underneath the concrete. As for the tons of radioactive trash, it will have to be continually stored in safely containers for more than 180 years. This is how long it takes for cesium-137 to go through 6 half-lives. A total of 6,500 people were exposed to radiation. Of the survivors, 500 people are still suffering from the long-term effects. Most of them still live in Goiania. Many belong to the former paramedics, firefighters, and police officers who were involved in the decontamination. Not all of them had been informed about the radioactive radiation by their superiors. In 1987, the military and the law of silence still ruled in Brazil. In December 1987, the now 63-year-old Horizon Alves Ferreira founded the Association of the Victims of Cesium-137. This story still weighs on us, he says. Even 30 years later, the Brazilian government has not fulfilled its obligations to the victims, he says. It's impossible to get the drugs we need. In addition, our pension, which is equivalent to 208 euros, or $233, is not even equal to the Brazilian minimum wage. The married couple Luisa Oded Mota dos Santos and Kardec Sebastião are also struggling with the devastating consequences of the contamination. No school wanted to accept our children, Luisa Oded recalls. Even today, our children don't like to talk about it. They still fear that they will be discriminated against. In light of the deaths caused, the 3 doctors who had owned and operated IGR were charged with criminal negligence because the accidents occurred before the promulgation of the Federal Constitution of 1988 and because the substance was acquired by the clinic and not by the individual owners. The court could not declare the owners of IGR liable. One of IGR's owners and the clinic's physicist were ordered to pay 100,000 real, equivalent to $24,000, for the derelict condition of the building. Roberto dos Santos Alves and Wagner Mota Pereira were never charged. Thank you for watching.